Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the third and final event of Budget Education Week, the grand finale. This is a AMA Ask Me Anything with Budget Director Nick Kovac. So before we get into the question and answer session, we've got just a short PowerPoint presentation. Really just want to give you a look at what it is we do here in the Budget Office, kind of from the Budget Office perspective, and kind of give you a sense of the process and how we go about developing a budget. So without further ado, first let me just go over a couple of ground rules for the GoToMeeting software. So it looks like many of you have attended the meetings that we've had yesterday and on Tuesday. We're going to kind of relax the rules a little bit, so feel free to raise your hand using the hand raise feature to if you'd like to speak and ask a question. You can also use the question feature to ask questions. We'll be monitoring both, and we're not going to set a time limit on your questions or on your statements. We're just going to kind of keep it a little more informal. So without further ado, let me introduce Budget Director Nick Kovac.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for that introduction. And as I mentioned on Tuesday, to those of you that are veterans of all three of these events from Budget Week, among his many other duties, Bill is our public outreach and education coordinator. So he has put together, I think, an interesting slideshow, and the one you're going to see today, if you are a veteran of the last two nights, is a little bit different. Certainly take any questions on things that happened the first 2 days, where we kind of gave you an overall budget overview on Tuesday, and then yesterday with the mayor, we really went into a lot of detail about the 2023 departmental requests, and the mayor also went over some of the historical issues primarily with funding from the state that has really limited our options for the 23 budget, and we expect we'll continue to limit our options beyond 23 unless there are changes at the state level. But tonight we're going to leave plenty of time for questions, and hopefully plenty of time for everyone to get to kick off of preseason game number 3 in Kansas City tonight. But we just have a brief PowerPoint, which is kind of letting you, as Bill said, letting you under the hood of what we do and our team of analysts here. And I think we're joined by most of them tonight. We mentioned Bill Christensen, Eric Pearson is also here, Brian Reinders, Mason Levy, and Sarah Osborne are here, and as is Andrea Fowler, who you heard from on Tuesday, is our ARPA director in the budget office. So letting you know who we are and what we do. This is a little bit of a repeat from the prior 2 nights, but it's a good summary to frame the timing and the rhythm of our tasks. In March, we send out the forms and instructions to departments. In May, those departments submit requests. We're now in June through September, where we analyze those requests and develop options for the mayor's review. The mayor makes his decisions and presents a budget next month to the Common Council. Then in October, the Common Council, along with the public, carefully reviews that proposed budget department by department. Then in November, they make changes. The mayor may or may not veto some of their changes, and then they may or may not override or sustain those vetoes. But then by November, we've got a fully adopted budget, just in time to send out the property tax bills. In March and through May, to give you a sense of the kinds of what we ask departments to do, we ask departments generally, we ask for a cost to continue budget. And the concept behind that is, what would it cost to continue current service levels into 2023? We know going in that we probably can't afford that, because for some of the reasons that were explained in the prior 2 nights about revenues for the most part being flat and expenses going up, usually with inflation, whether it's contracts or operations or salaries. But cost to continue does provide a useful starting point. And then we got those on May 10th. And the first task we do is a technical review. We made sure the departments complete all the forms. We made sure they use the correct assumptions, like, we have standard fuel rates and fringe benefits. We check for technical errors, and we summarize all those requests, and that gives us our first look. And we did that. By the middle of May, we realized there was a $151 million gap, where we thought it was going to be about 2/3 of that. And so the very first thing we did was, after that technical review, was try to take a real close look at, hey, did somebody make a big mistake? We actually were rooting for a big mistake, because we didn't want that number to be so high, but there really weren't any big mistakes. There was a variety of reasons why the number was so high this year. And we provided the mayor with that information. And And then we began a more detailed substantive review where we verified the compliance of cost to continue. And we were able to take off about $15 million for things that were not cost to continue. Now, some of those things we still might want to fund. They might be worth doing, but we sort of recognized that those were additional requests that departments may have made to enhance service levels or change service models. We take a real close look at any new positions, equipment, or any large operating account increases to figure out, again, why that might be occurring. Was it necessary or inevitable, or is it something we can make an easily first cut on? And then we put all that on a scorecard. Brian Reinders is our lead summarizer, along with Bill and Mason, and we keep a running scorecard of whether or not our budget is balanced yet. Now, as we try to balance this budget, we obviously get some initial guidance from the mayor about big picture priorities the mayor's has, and then we start developing strategies for closing the gap. Now, there's ways to this arrow is going up because, in theory, because revenues could go up. Our biggest revenue category, state shared revenue, has not gone up for 20 years. In fact, has gone down, and that's the biggest factor driving our gap. But we have a number of other things like municipal service charges, license permit fees, other miscellaneous revenue where we do have some autonomy over, so we can look at ways to increase revenue through fees, permits, etc. There are state laws that restrict our options there, but within those state limitations, we have some autonomy. The other way to close the gap, you either make more money or you spend less money. And so when you start looking at how do we close the gap, there's a couple, this is speaking very broadly and conceptually, there's a couple of ways to do it. You could just say across the board reductions, the same percentage from every department, because fair is fair. That's perceived as fair, and then it also gives easily identifiable targets to departments, but that can be much more challenging for some departments than others. In some cases, you have a lot of departments that are quite revenue generating. In fact, DNS generates more revenue than it costs overall. And some departments have more grants and more revenues than others. And also, some departments might be more scalable, and there's a variety of reasons why they might be more scalable than others in terms of, can I cut just a couple of positions and expect a proportionate reduction in service, as opposed to do all these positions work together in a fundamental way? So even if I just cut a couple, am I compromising the entire service? So that's the kind of detailed analysis that each budget analyst does with each department to try to figure out what cuts are even practical or possible and actually do achieve savings. Because, I mean, if you cut a parking checker, you're going to lose money, because parking checkers generate more money than they cost on an annual basis. So you've got to do that kind of analysis, as well as looking at working very closely with departments, because they know best how their departments work, whether or not the cuts are even possible or practical or produce savings. And once you do that, then you start, then you begin the process of laying out recommendations we might make to the mayor and presenting him with multiple options on how we could close the gap. Generally speaking, it's often a combination of both approaches, and this year has been no exception, where you set some across the board targets, but when you ultimately make your decisions, you do that in a targeted way, responding to the realities of each department. There's a lot of communication between our office and the budget office, and that's the closer we get to the due date of the mayor presenting his budget in September, the more that communication is increasing. And then, of course, there's also communication between the analysts in the department, or myself in the department, and between the mayor and the department. So in many cases, all of us get together and talk through some of the big decisions, all leading up to September 20th, which is less than a month away now, when Mayor Johnson will present his executive proposed budget to the Common Council. We'll, as he's getting ready for that, we'll carefully review all the calculations, we'll finalize the line items, we'll prepare summaries, and get ready to present all this to the public and to the council in October. And now is your chance to ask any follow-up questions or bring up new topics tonight. Please feel free to raise your hand, and then there's and we can also accept. I think we can. Is Patricia Ruiz Cantu here? I see a comment from here. I think we may be able to do Spanish translation as well with Patricia Ruiz Cantu. So, has anyone raised their hand yet, Bill?
No, not yet. So if anybody would like to have a question, make a comment, please feel free to raise your hand, and we'll go ahead and get you unmuted, and you can ask the budget director anything you'd like. I see a couple of familiar names on here. Jim Claybor, are you sure you don't have a tough question for us? Okay, we do have a written question, and this one comes from Kevin Blanco. So Kevin asks, the city is hiring new people daily. In the event of cutbacks, will they be laid off first?
Well, there's two different kinds of cutbacks. One would be attritional, meaning we're eliminating positions that are currently vacant, or we expect will be vacant by January 1st, 2023. And then the other would be layoffs, where we're actually eliminating filled positions, which would result in someone not having a job. So even though we're expecting big cuts this year, I don't want to. We're hopeful that in one of the mayor's goals, and nothing's final yet till the 20th, but we're hopeful that we'll be able to achieve cuts through attrition in all departments. So that's our goal. So in concept, hopefully that will remain a hypothetical question, at least for 2023. Given the structural realities, if we don't get more money from the state, 2024 might not. It might be harder for that hope to be maintained. But it's certainly a priority of this mayor to prevent layoffs and to use attrition where possible. But if there were to be layoffs, it does vary by union contracts and city service rules. But generally speaking, yes, there's the principle of last hired, first fired.
We do have a speaker that has raised their hand, Richard Diaz. So Richard, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, and just make sure you unmute yourself, and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak, Budget Director Kovac. I'm sure you've gotten a lot of questions about the infrastructure bill, and I see that your office has a specific staff person earmarked for ARPA investments.
Yes.
Has the city given any consideration to how much of an impact the formula funded money from the bipartisan infrastructure law will have on city programs? And also, are there any investments that are discretionary or competitive that the city has identified as worth going after to increase the likelihood of achieving our goals?
Well, can you clarify what that second question? Investments to do what?
So, you know, the bill, the bipartisan infrastructure law, has formula funded programs where, you know, most government sizes get something, in some cases, distributed through the states. And then there are also other pots of money through discretionary grants. So competitive grant process where cities, nonprofits, states will be pinned against each other to highlight specific projects.
So in general, yeah, the infrastructure bill definitely provides an opportunity. It's not quite as large of an opportunity or as a, I mean, ARPA, the American Rescue Plan Act money there were quite a few rules associated with it, but it was also a rather large lump sum that we were given quite a bit of autonomy to deal with within certain categories that had some limits. And then not just limits on spending within them, but also limits on how they could be spent within categories. Yeah, with these infrastructure bill, like a lot of other road aids that we traditionally get from the state, there's a bit more of a process where we've got to apply. And in some cases, like you said, there's going to be a formula. So we do expect there to be some benefit from that. And I know that the IRD, the Intergovernmental Relations Division, is working very closely with the Department of Public Works that accepts a lot of the infrastructure investment. And we do expect that should be a gain. A lot of that money often does come with matching dollars, where the majority is funded by federal and state, but there's some local match. And truth be told, that there's, generally speaking, we have this principle of wanting to accept as much of that money as we can, but even that local match, given some of our limitations, even making that local match on some of these large infrastructure projects may prove to be a challenge to keep our overall capital borrowing within bounds. Generally, we like to borrow when we're leveraging money because we get so much more bang for our buck, and that's still one of our guiding principles. But the scale of this investment and the scale of our budget current structural deficit is putting some pressure on that principle in some cases. But overall, it's great news. It's great news that the federal government is making those investments, and that is something that we'll be working closely, like I said, with IRD and with DPW on maximizing the impact of those investments. Does that answer your question, Richard? Or?
Yeah, no, that's a great response.
Yeah,
I do have a second question
sure.
in regards to you know, I don't really know how to phrase this. I'm just gonna be raw. uh,
Okay.
how I guess how do we foresee the city being able to pay market wages to employees so that we can successfully, retain and promote people through city careers and jobs? And I know that we're facing significant constraints through the deficit that we're in, but are there any creative ideas floating out there from the budget office? I know we want to anticipate some more support from the state, but if we did get state support, I guess how would we be able to encourage more worker productivity
Yeah.
and mobility within city departments?
Well, even if we don't get state support, we need to invest in our workers and keep up with the market, not just because it's the right thing to do to create family supporting jobs in the city, but because as a practical matter, if you don't do that, you won't have any workers left, which, okay, in the short term, I guess that saves you money because everybody left, but then now you can't deliver services. I know I think there's another question from Mark, which I'll get to in more detail when we get to it, about whether it costs you more to do outside contracting work. So even if, I mean, obviously it would be nice to get more money from the state so we can both staff up and make sure the staff are paid at a competitive level. But because of the still residual effects of Act 10 that was passed over 10 years ago now, where essentially bargaining power was more or less taken away from everyone but the police and fire unions, the state basically said, we're going to cut your money and we expect you to use that cut to take it from your workers. We expect you to stop giving your workers raises because they can't bargain for raises anymore. And frankly, for a long time, we did that. And probably we did that for too long. Not probably, we did do that for too long, because we are starting to see in a lot of, in all categories, but in some categories more than others of workers, especially the building trades and other kinds of trades work, we're seeing people leave for more money elsewhere, whether it's with private contractors or for suburbs that are able to offer more. So it is a real dilemma. I think the mayor, the way he describes it is, we can't afford to do it, but we also can't afford not to do it. And the it meaning start to provide competitive wages for our workers. So we're trying to hit a balance there where we can, one person, on the one hand, a taxpayer might say, well, if you have less money and you can afford less workers, how can you afford to pay the remaining workers even more? In some ways, the question answers itself, because if you're going to try to do similar amounts of work with less workers, you should probably pay them more, just from a fairness perspective. But from a, again, practical market-based perspective, you can't run an operation if you don't have some consistency in your employment, and you end up, if you have high turnover rates, you end up spending a lot of money on recruitment and training, and then the investment you make in the recruitment and the training doesn't even pay off, because you start recruiting and training again if you can't retain workers. So we are looking at, and it's in the requested budget. I mean, the proposed budget again is coming out in a month, but it's in the requests, for across the board raises, as well as for longevity pay. We used to have steps where people got bumps every year, and that went away after Act 10. But we're not bringing back steps per se, but there's a proposal to bring back some kind of bonus for workers that have stayed here for 5 years. So we're looking at that, and we're also aggressively, in a targeted way, reclassifying entire categories of workers, in addition to the longevity increase and the across-the-board raises. So that's done in response to the realities on the ground, which is that inflation is high and the job market is such that people are able to get better offers outside the city, and we've got to stay competitive.
Nick, we've got a written question that touches on really the same topic about city workforce, and this is from Mark Pelzek. And the question is, how much does the city spend on subcontracted work that was previously done by city employees? And has anyone looked into potential cost savings of bringing that work back to city employees in-house?
Yes, absolutely. Now, the answer is going to vary a little bit department by department, but certainly like in the Department of Public Works, where we're doing quite a bit of stump grinding. There's a combination of stump grinding done privately and through city workers. Certainly snow plowing is another example where we do some private contracting, as well as there's a number of different examples within the Department of Public Works operations and Department of Public Works infrastructure. So there are some cases where most of the work is done by contractors, especially with a lot of major road reconstruction projects where we maybe don't have the overhead and the capital and some of the equipment to do that on a regular basis. But there's a lot of ongoing operational consistent work where it really does make sense to have a city employee do it. And it's definitely more expensive to contract it out. Or in some departments, if you can't contract it out, you end up paying your existing workers overtime, which costs us more and burns them out. So definitely being on the one hand, you might say, oh, well, if people are leaving, then you're saving money because you have less salaries to pay. But that's only the beginning of that's only the first page of the story. Page number 2 is, wait a minute, we still got to get the work done. So we either ask our existing employees to do more, and if they're and that again costs us more in overtime and burns them out, or we contract out privately. And so that's definitely a factor, and probably we should provide even a more detailed, to your question, Mark, of whether, I think the question was whether a study had been done, or we've definitely looked at it, and we could probably look at producing a more detailed analysis to show those trade-offs in various divisions, various departments. But it's definitely a factor we consider, and there's many cases where the fiscally smart thing to do is to bulk up your existing staffing, for sure.
Okay, I don't see any other hands raised at this point, so anybody who's in attendance, if you'd like to ask any questions on any topic, whether it's technical or policy about the budget or about what it is we do in the budget office, feel free to raise your hand. Oh, I see we do have a question. Patricia, I will unmute you now, and the floor is yours. Go ahead and unmute yourself first, and the floor is yours.
Hello, I just wanted to thank the staff for a wonderful presentation and allowing us to listen and ask questions. So thank you, you guys rock.
Thank you. So if there's no more questions, we can start talking about the offensive line rotation or backup safety. That's what I'll be watching tonight. We're also pretty thin at outside linebacker after the 2 starters. So you see if anyone shows up tonight, puts pressure on the quarterback.
Oh, Nick, we do have a question, and this question, well, we have one that says they're going to have 10 offensive linemen on the 53-man roster.
Well, especially if Bakhtiari and Jenkins aren't going to be active week 1, we might even have 11 then, because I think that's probably right, Ryan.
Good to have depth, right?
Yeah.
Okay, and Daniel Loria has asked the question, could you go into more detail on the $150 million gap? How does this compare to previous years?
It is the highest we have on record. And now a big part of it is that there was built into that a $50 million projected increase in the pension contribution from, we had been paying in the last 5-year contribution window, $71 million. And we guesstimated when the requests were coming in that would go up to about 121. And we actually still won't know our final answer on that until the spring of 2023. So we're obviously, in terms of knowing exactly what our new 5-year commitment is on the budget, we're going to have to pick a number that's somewhere near where we think it might be. But we do expect, so that drives a big chunk of it. I mean, going back 20 years ago, it was the investment returns were so high that even the normal cost, the annual cost of paying benefits or future costs of paying benefits, the normal cost was covered by our investment returns. That stopped being true around 2008 or 9. And so we went from 0 to 60 and then to 70 in the last 2 5-year stable contribution windows. So if you're looking for what's different about 23 than all prior years, 50 million of that 150 answer is this $50 million increase in a pension payment. But there were obviously, that's only 1/3 of it. There's a lot of other factors. There's not like one huge line item that jumps out. We actually did a very detailed analysis of this internally to try to figure out, hey, and we asked all of our analysts to sort of track not just what was different from last year, and not just what was different from cost to continue, but what was different from our projection, which wasn't the easiest thing to do because our projection involved just some guesswork on percentages overall. But we kind of went back and looked at a bunch of things, and we were able to account for most of it, but it's hard for me to tell that story narratively because it was just a lot of little things that cost a little bit more than you would think. So everything just crept up a bit more. And so that would explain, ends up explaining about a $55 million difference. I could explain some of that too. We were hoping that we could bulk up the pension reserve by 10 million. So you could actually factor in even 60 million of it as pension related gap, so to speak. But there's costs keep going up. And then when revenue's flat, that creates the gap. But yes, this year was way higher than prior years. And the average for the prior 20 years was 1/3 of 151. So generally speaking, like I said, we were able to knock 15 million off right off the bat because of cost to continue. But past that, we had to make some tough decisions about the pension and how much we can commit going forward. And we had to make a lot of tough decisions in every department about ways to reduce costs.
Okay, and then we've got another written question from Kevin Blanco, and the question is, when will a decision be made whether or not to save city jobs using the second disbursement of ARPA dollars?
That decision's already been made that we're doing that. Now, at what scale this year and next year, and could we do even more is a question for the Common Council and the ARPA task force they've created. But the Common Council did agree in concept to spend 75 million of the second tranche of ARPA money. So we got 394 million total. Let's just say 400 round numbers, and that came in 2 disbursements of 200 million. The first tranche has already been allocated. A good chunk of that first tranche of money, that first 200 million, did also go to saving city jobs, but we also created some new programs, a lot of them in housing and a lot of them in lead remediation and job creation. And so those programs we did create with the first tranche of ARPA money. Our fiscal situation obviously has become even more dire just between ARPA first getting announced and now just a couple years past that into the second tranche of money. Also, the way the federal rules work, we are able to spend the first tranche, even if we wanted to spend it all on saving city jobs, we couldn't have because of the way the federal rules were structured in terms of how they calculate the amount of lost revenue you're able to claim in that particular category. But now in this year and next year, the amount we can spend on lost revenue is higher than 75 million. So the council did commit to that. So half of that $51 million gap is covered by that 75 million in ARPA. So, and then, like I said, 15 million was cost to continue. So now we're cooking with gas, I guess. Just by saying those two things, we've knocked it down to about 60 million. So ARPA is a huge factor in allowing us to fill the gap this year. The Common Council hasn't yet voted on what to do with the money next year. They've created this community task force to review ideas, but I don't think it's any secret that my recommendation would be to spend as much of that money as possible on preventing these cuts so that we can stay within the attritional boundaries and not lay people off. If it weren't for ARPA, we would be talking about massive layoffs in this next budget already. ARPA has allowed us to keep our head barely above water while still making significant service reductions. And when ARPA expires in 2025, we've got a few ideas, but our main idea would be that the state recognizes the seriousness of the problem and intervenes. Failing that, it'll have to be a much more significant cuts in 25 and 6 and 7. But the ARPA money in the 23 and 24 budgets, these next 2 budgets, does allow us to plug, at least about half of the gap.
Okay, I don't see any other questions that are written right now. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask verbally? Feel free to raise your hand and we can unmute you and you can go ahead and ask your question. Otherwise, in the meantime, Nick, who do you think is going to have more receiving yards this year? You like Alan Lazard or Sammy Watkins?
Juwan Winfrey. Keep your eye on Juwan Winfrey. When Devontae went down last year in Kansas City, he took his snaps, or not in Kansas City, I forget which game, Arizona. Juwan actually played Devontae's position. So I expect big things out of him.
Okay, all right.
And he's on some people's cut list, but I think he's going to lead the team in receiving yards.
A sleeper. Make sure you got him on your fantasy team.
All right, well, if there's no other questions, we can all start pre-gaming, I guess. Thank you for everyone for your involvement. And if you think of a question later, feel free to email me or call me or contact the budget office. 286-8552 is the number, and nikovac@milwaukee.gov is my email.
All right, thanks everybody for attending.